Hello everyone, tonight we're asking a very cheerful question. How much was a human life actually worth in ancient tribes? Spoiler, sometimes the answer was 10 cows, sometimes it was your cousin's ransom, and occasionally it was just a polite shove off a cliff. From infants abandoned in famine, to brides traded for livestock, to unlucky captives buried alive on mountaintops, you'll see that human value has always been disturbingly negotiable. So, if you enjoy wandering through the darker corners of history with me, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is right now. I always love seeing this odd little community stretching across time zones like a web. Now, dim the lights, settle into the quiet, maybe pour some tea, or just let the night hum around you. And together, let's step into a world where human life was never priceless, only priced. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Imagine this: you've just been born, and before anyone's even decided whether your nose looks more like your mother's or your uncle's, someone's already calculating if you're worth the trouble. Not your cuteness, not your potential, your worth. Because in a small, hungry tribe, you're not a baby. You're a future investment, a liability wrapped in skin, a mouth competing with the goats for milk. If you'd been born in certain foraging groups, your cries weren't just background noise. There were alarms ringing in your mother's mind. Do we have enough food for this one? Can I carry another child when my back is already bent like a bowstring? Harsh arithmetic, yes, but survival didn't come with a sentimental soft filter. Infanticide wasn't whispered about, it was a possibility. Especially in seasons when the wild berries shrank on the branch and the men came home empty-handed from the hunt. And before you clutch your modern pearls, remember, this wasn't cruelty, it was called biology in action. 1 week season, and everyone could go under. Now, not every culture pressed the same cruel ledger. Among some groups, every child was the tribe's treasure chest, guarded fiercely because children weren't just bodies, they were memory keepers, future hunters, future mothers, little vessels of tradition who'd one day be expected to carry the weight of myths and the direction of migrations. Your mere existence could be a triumph. But here's the kicker: your value was elastic. In times of plenty, your giggles were sacred. In times of famine, they were background noise people wished they could mute. And let's not forget the cosmic scorekeeping. Some communities believe births weren't accidental. A star blinking, an animal behaving strangely, the sudden death of a relative, all these could signal what your life was worth before you'd even had the chance to open your eyes. If you'd been born breech, or during an eclipse, well, congratulations, you might already be marked as special, sacred, or unlucky enough to make people quietly shuffle away when you entered the hut. It gets better. Your gender could tip the scales instantly. Born male, you might be celebrated as the next spearholder, someone who'd one day defend the herds and the fire circle. Born female, you might be praised for your fertility and the countless hours you'd one day spend grinding grain until your arms looked like carved stone. But if the camp already had too many mouths of your particular gender, the celebration dimmed fast. You see, in societies balancing on the knife edge of subsistence, the value of a body wasn't measured in sentiment, but in logistics. And if you think the modern obsession with birth statistics is clinical, try being born in a world where your survival rate was a running bet. Half of you might not even make it past 5 years old. That means each birth was both a joy and a risk, a coin toss with the gods, the spirits, or sheer dumb luck. You were either going to grow up to contribute or die before you ever mattered. Either way, your existence carried weight from the second someone cut the cord with a flint blade. So, know your first cries weren't cute background noise. They were the opening line in a negotiation between your tiny lungs and the unforgiving ledger of survival. And as you lay swaddled in hides or leaves, someone, maybe your exhausted mother, maybe the entire band, was already calculating your future. A calculation not of dreams or college funds, but of meat, firewood, and the tribe's fragile odds of making it through the next winter. And that's just birth. Because if you think making it out of infancy meant you were in the clear, wait until you see how your worth was measured once you were old enough to carry wood or herd goats. So, you've survived the coin toss of infancy. Congratulations. You didn't get buried under a cairn of stones or quietly returned to the spirits. That means you've officially made it to the next stage of life, being small, loud, and most importantly useful, Childhood in ancient tribes wasn't a golden age of innocence, it was a probationary period. You weren't a kid, you were a trainee tool. From the moment you could walk without falling into the fire pit, your value started to rise. Not because you were charming or adorable, but because you could be put to work, fetching water, collecting sticks, watching the goats so they didn't wander into someone else's pasture. These were your job descriptions. Forget playdates and finger painting. Your playtime was following older siblings into the scrub, carrying bundles of thorny wood twice your height, or practicing with a child-sized spear you were expected not to impale yourself on. And oh, don't think you'd get away with sulking. In some societies, laziness wasn't an option, it was a death sentence. A child who didn't learn early to contribute was basically dragging the group down. Anthropologists have found over and over that kids weren't treated as helpless. They were little adults in practice. Among the Ruhonzi, for instance, children began gathering edible roots and berries while still small enough to be carried on a hip. In pastoral groups, children were herding animals almost as soon as they could run, their tiny legs chasing after sheep or reindeer in landscapes that could swallow them whole. Childhood was apprenticeship in survival. You might think this sounds cruel, but honestly, it was just efficient. Nobody had the bandwidth to entertain children with wooden blocks. Your toys were miniature versions of adult tools. Little bows, little pots, little grinding stones. Anthropologists have noted that these weren't just toys, they were training gear. You'd practice endlessly until one day you weren't playing anymore. You were simply doing it for real, because the tribe depended on you too. And here's where your worth was always tied to probability. Could you survive disease? Would you avoid accidents? Could you grow into the kind of adult who could pull your weight? That uncertainty made you precious and expendable at the same time. Families invested in you, yes, but never blindly. High child mortality rate meant parents had to live in a paradox. Love fiercely, but not too much, because half of you weren't going to make it. Even your little mistakes carried weight. Drop a pot of water, and someone's walking farther tomorrow. Lose track of a goat, and that's meat gone, or a feud started with the neighbors. The margin of error was slim, and your life's value was tied to how few mistakes you made along the way. But when you got it right, when you came home with an armful of dry wood, or led the goats back without losing one, you weren't just a child anymore. You were proof the tribe's investment was paying off. Every contribution you made stretched survival just a bit further. Gave your mother a moment of rest, allowed your father to hunt one more hour without worrying the camp would fall apart in his absence. You see, in a world where calories were counted in footsteps and risk was measured in seasons, children weren't decorative. They were energy inputs. You didn't just represent the future. You were already being cashed in for survival value long before your adult teeth grew in. And just when you thought you were safe because you were pulling your weight, well, let's talk about how your gender could suddenly tip the scales of your value whether you liked it or not. So you're finally carrying your weight, dragging bundles of firewood home, chasing goats, maybe even hauling water without spilling it all over yourself. You'd think that's enough to secure your spot. But no, now your worth starts getting filtered through something even more arbitrary. The body you happened to be born into. If you were born male, your value was framed in spears and shields. You were expected to one day hunt, raid, or defend the camp, which meant everyone was secretly calculating how many calories they should invest in you now, to reap a return later. A boy was a future weapon, a walking insurance policy. Among pastoralists, like the Maasai or the Mongols, sons meant warriors to guard the herds, protect the pastures, and expand territory. In farming groups, sons meant more hands for plowing and clearing land. In some places, sons also meant political pawns, future grooms, in exchange marriages that could seal alliances. In short, if you were male, your existence was measured in muscle potential. If you were female, your worth was equally pragmatic, just measured differently. You weren't a future warrior, you were a future womb. Your survival meant the survival of everyone else. Among agricultural tribes, girls were valued for their ability to bear children and contribute endless labor, pounding grain, hauling water, weaving, tending gardens. Among pastoralists, brides brought your value could be calculated in how many cows your marriage would fetch for your family. The word bride price wasn't symbolic, it was a direct exchange. A girl might be worth 10 goats, 20 cows, or a stack of iron tools, depending on her health, her family's status. and how desperately her groom's family needed to secure alliances. And here's the twist. Sometimes the scales tipped. In societies plagued by conflict, boys were more valuable, because defense mattered more than fertility. In times of famine or disease, women's lives rose in worth, because only women could guarantee future generations. Value wasn't a fixed category, it fluctuated like market prices. Imagine being 6 years old and already your stock was being quietly calculated by adults with worried faces and rough hands. That's why infanticide was often gendered. Too many girls meant fewer defenders, so daughters were sometimes abandoned. Too many boys meant the group couldn't feed them all, so sons were sometimes returned to the spirits. It wasn't personal, it was economics written in flesh. Cold, pragmatic, and heartbreaking to modern ears. But in those worlds, balance mattered more than sentiment. It also meant your freedom was limited. A boy couldn't just decide he wanted to spend his life weaving baskets, and a girl couldn't declare she'd rather throw spears than grind millet. Your role was not a choice. It was a preloaded expectation. Step out of it, and you weren't eccentric, you were a liability. Of course, there were exceptions. Some cultures blurred these lines. Women fought as warriors in parts of West Africa, like the famous Dahomey regiments. Men became healers, shamans, or storytellers instead of fighters. But those exceptions stood out precisely because the baseline was so rigid. Your body dictated your value. So while you were still a child, your worth wasn't just measured in calories fetched or goats herded, it was already projected into your reproductive organs, your muscles, and your ability to conform to a script written long before you were born. And once your body had been catalogued and judged, the next question was whose blood flowed through your veins, because kinship and ancestry could either make you priceless or make you expendable. By now, you've been measured in chores and in body parts. But here's where your real price tag shows up, your bloodline. Because in ancient tribes, your family wasn't just your family. It was your credit rating, your insurance policy, your personal army, and your funeral plan all rolled into one. Let's start with the basics. Kin were priceless. The people tied to you by blood were considered an extension of your own flesh. Kill a cousin, and you didn't just lose one person, you tore a hole in the whole social fabric. That's why many societies had systems of compensation when a life was taken. Among the Germanic tribes, it was called wergeld, literally man price. Kill someone, and you'd better pay their family in cattle, silver, or goods, or risk a blood feud that could spiral for generations. And this wasn't just Europe. Across Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, similar systems existed. A life could be compensated, not erased, but the cost wasn't random. A noble might be worth 20 cows, a commoner only 5. Equality under the law. Cute idea. Didn't exist. If you were inside the kin group, your value was sky high. You'd be defended, avenged, mourned with ritual. But if you were an outsider, your life could be priced, traded, or even written off without much fuss. That's the cruel math of kinship. It created circles of sacredness, and anyone outside the circle was negotiable. A stranger's death was a statistic. A kinsman's death was a cosmic tear that had to be mended. And don't think you could just float between groups. Bloodlines were boundaries. Your worth was tied to lineage, marriage alliances, and who owed loyalty to whom. If you belonged to a powerful family, your life was leverage. You could be held hostage to secure peace, married off to seal an alliance, or ransomed for goods. Your value wasn't really about you. It was about the network of people who claimed you. Of course, bloodlines also meant feuds. If your uncle killed someone, congratulations, you might be dragged into paying the price. Whole families bore the debt of one reckless act. Anthropologists, studying pastoral societies in East Africa, describe how a single killing could ignite cycles of cattle raids, revenge, and counter-raids, stretching decades. You might be 10 years old, and already marked as one of the boys who owes us blood. And then there's inheritance. If you were born into the right lineage, your value skyrocketed, because you carried the future of property, ritual authority, or even kingship in your veins. Entire wars were fought over whose blood was purer, whose cousin was closer, or whose great-grandmother once slept in the right hut. Now, kinship wasn't just biology, it was politics. Some groups adopted outsiders into their bloodlines, transforming them from captives into family. Suddenly, their worth flipped from expendable to sacred. It wasn't sentimental, it was strategic. Adoption swelled numbers. healed feuds, and turned strangers into allies. Blood could be invented, stretched, and claimed, all in the name of survival. So your life's worth wasn't floating in the air. It was pinned firmly to who you were related to, how much power your family carried, and how many people were willing to avenge your death. And if your bloodline was strong, you could walk through camp with invisible armor. If it wasn't, well, better hope you ran fast, or married well. And speaking of outsiders being flipped from expendable to valuable, let's talk about what happened when your tribe decided not to kill an enemy, but to keep them, because capture could sometimes be worth more than blood. Let's say you're unlucky. You weren't born into the right bloodline, or maybe you had the misfortune of living on the border of a tribe that liked to raid on Wednesdays. One moment you're tending goats, the next your property. Because here's the truth, in many ancient societies, killing an enemy was wasteful. Keeping them alive, that was an investment. Slavery wasn't the big industrialized machine it would later become under empires, but it existed everywhere, and it was always practical. Among hunter-gatherers, captives might be absorbed into the group, doing the hard labor no one wanted, fetching water, pounding grain, or herding animals. Among pastoralists and farmers, captives could be traded, ransomed, or gifted to cement alliances. In West Africa, for example, captives became part of bride price exchanges, or were integrated into lineages after a period of servitude. In the Pacific, captured warriors could be sacrificed to gods, or kept alive as walking trophies, living proof of the tribe's power. And if you were captured as a child, your odds weren't terrible. Children were easier to mold, easier to adopt into the fabric of the tribe, sometimes even treated as kin after a few years. But adults, especially men, your life value was closer to that of a disposable tool. You could be worked to death, sacrificed, or kept as insurance in case your family wanted you back badly enough to pay in livestock or goods. There's irony in this. The same person who'd be killed without hesitation in battle could become more valuable alive as a slave than dead as a corpse. Economically speaking, you were portable wealth. A cow could be stolen, a hut could burn, but a human being could walk, carry, build, and reproduce. That made you both priceless and very, very disposable. Anthropologists studying North American tribes noted that captives could be ritually adopted, replacing lost kin. A murdered son could be replaced by capturing another boy and absorbing him into the family. The worth of the captive wasn't their individuality, it was their ability to fill a hole in someone else's lineage. You weren't a person. You were a plug for grief. But don't imagine this was some sweet adoption story. The process could be brutal. Captives were sometimes beaten or scarred to mark their new identity, or forced to undergo humiliating rituals to erase their old life. Some groups demanded loyalty tests, prove your worth or die. If you passed, you lived as family. If not, you were sacrificed to the gods or left to rot. And slavery wasn't always permanent. Ransom was big business. A captive's worth could be negotiated. A herd of goats, a pile of iron blades, a few jars of salt. Your body was basically a bargaining chip in someone else's politics. If your kin could pay, you walked free. If not, congratulations. You just became part of the labor force or the dinner menu, depending on the culture. So when you think about your life's worth here, it's a grim ledger. Dead, you were a brief victory. Alive, you were a tool, a hostage, a replacement, a walking piece of wealth. And if you thought marriage might finally put a stable value on your life, well, prepare yourself. Because when the time came, your body could be priced not just as labor but as dowry, bride price, or alliance currency. So, you've survived infancy, pulled your weight as a child, and if you weren't captured, managed to dodge being turned into someone's replacement cousin. Now comes the next great valuation of your existence, marriage. And trust me, it wasn't about romance, or true love, or any of those sentimental inventions that came much later with poets and cheap jewelry. Marriage in ancient tribes was a transaction. Your body wasn't just yours, it was a ledger entry. If you were female, your worth was often measured in livestock. Bride price was the standard across much of Africa, Asia, and even parts of Europe. A family giving up a daughter didn't just lose a set of hands. They lost the future children she would bear and the labor she would contribute. So compensation was expected. A woman might be worth 10 cows, 20 goats, or several iron tools, depending on her health, her age, and the political standing of her family. In some pastoral societies, like the Dinka or the Nuer, entire herds could be exchanged for a bride. Your womb was literally walking wealth. If you were male, the calculation was flipped. You weren't being valued, you were paying. To marry, you had to compensate your bride's family for the loss of their asset. That meant years of work to accumulate cattle, shells, or other valuables. Among the Kung, men sometimes worked for years in their father-in-law's household before being allowed to marry the daughter. Picture it, you're essentially an unpaid intern with romantic aspirations. Dowry, on the other hand, worked differently. In South Asia and parts of the Mediterranean, families of brides gave wealth to the groom's household goods, textiles, land, jewelry. This wasn't generosity, it was a survival strategy. The dowry acted as insurance for the bride, giving her leverage in her new home. If her husband mistreated her, she still had wealth tied to her. Her worth, again, was carefully measured and transferred through property. And don't get the idea this was all polite negotiation. These exchanges could make or break alliances. A bride could tie families together or cause feuds if her price was seen as unfair. In some cases, bride price disputes sparked wars. Imagine your marriage being the trigger for a cattle raid. Romantic, isn't it? It also meant that marriage wasn't about who you liked, but about who your kin needed. Your cousin might have been promised away years before she even hit puberty, because her marriage secured grazing rights. You could be sent to live with a family you barely knew, all because your worth had already been cashed in long before you had opinions about it. And once you were married, your value didn't just vanish into domestic bliss. You were expected to reap. The worth of your life was measured in how many children you produced, how much labor they could provide, and how many alliances could be spun out of their eventual marriages. Your personal feelings weren't the point. You were a reproductive and economic node in a much larger web. So, no, marriage wasn't the happy ending. It was the next phase of commodification. You were a dowry chest, a bride price, a calculated transaction between families. And if you thought death might at least free you from being traded like livestock, think again. Because in some places, your life's ultimate worth was settled, not in marriage negotiations, but in how suitable you were as an offering to the gods. So you've been born, you've worked, you've been traded through marriage negotiations, and you might think your value has finally stabilized. But no, because in many ancient societies, the ultimate measure of a human life wasn't just labor or lineage. It was whether your body could be handed over to the gods as a cosmic bribe. Welcome to the world of ritual sacrifice, where your worth was suddenly translated into divine currency. Let's be clear, sacrifice wasn't random sadism. It was logic, just a very different kind. If rains failed, if crops withered, if enemies pressed too close, someone had to pay. And not with goats, not with chickens, but with human blood. Across Mesoamerica, for example, the Aztecs sacrificed captives to ensure the sun would rise, their priests cutting hearts out atop pyramids while drums thundered below. In the Andes, the Inca selected children, healthy, unblemished, sometimes even nobly born for Copacoca rituals, burying them alive on mountaintops as offerings to mountain spirits. Imagine being chosen because you were too perfect. Congratulations, you're beautiful enough to freeze to death for cosmic stability. Elsewhere, human sacrifice could appear in subtler forms. In parts of West Africa, victims were killed to sanctify new kings or to bless harvests. In ancient Europe, bog bodies like the Tolan Mancho, the ritual killing of people as offerings, their corpses preserved in peat as eternal pledges to the gods. And in the Pacific Islands, sacrifices were offered when new canoes were built or temples erected. You weren't just a person, you were building material for cosmic order, and the criteria for being chosen were rarely in your control. Maybe you were a captive bad luck, but understandable. But maybe you were selected because you were unusually handsome, or a child of high status, or born under the wrong star. In some cultures, virgins were prized. In others, warriors. Sometimes it was criminals, but often it was the innocent, precisely because their lives were seen as pure. The cruel irony, the better you were, the higher your odds of being killed. Now, here's the eerie part. For the community, your death wasn't seen as waste, it was transformation. Your life, instead of being measured in cows or shells, was suddenly tied to rain, fertility, and cosmic balance. One person's blood might buy the survival of hundreds. You were, in their eyes, worth infinitely more dead than alive. And don't imagine the rituals were hushed or private. They were theater public, spectacular, often meant to be witnessed by as many eyes as possible. Your death was a performance, a reassurance to the tribe that the universe was still listening. Every gasp, every drop of blood, every chant was part of a cosmic negotiation. And while you, the offering, had no say in the matter, your body became the bargaining chip for the survival of all. So yes, your life could be valued as bride price or dowry, but sometimes the highest honor or greatest misfortune was to be valued as a direct message to the gods. And if that wasn't enough, remember, not every life lost in ritual was balanced by divine gratitude. Sometimes the gods didn't answer. The rains still failed, the crops still died, and the tribe still starved, which meant someone else had to pay. Because once death itself became negotiable, revenge wasn't far behind. And that leads us into another ancient calculus: how much your life was worth in the endless cycle of blood feuds and retribution. So let's say you weren't married off for cows or offered to the gods on a stone altar. Don't relax just yet. Your life was still negotiable in another economy entirely: revenge. In many ancient tribes, a single death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a debt, and debts demanded payment. If your cousin got speared in a raid, it wasn't filed away as tragic loss. No, it became a line item in the clan's blood account. Somebody owed you, and until that balance was settled, the world was considered off-kilter. Which meant your life wasn't just yours, it was collateral in an ongoing feud. You were suddenly worth however many cows, goats, or jars of beer it took to soothe an enemy's grief. And if payment wasn't forthcoming, well, congratulations, you or your kin were fair game. This wasn't random violence. It was structured, almost bureaucratic. The Germanic tribes had wurgled. Bedouins had blood compensation. Many African societies had cattle fines. Kill someone of high status, and the price could bankrupt you. Kill a commoner, and the payment was lighter. In other words, lives weren't valued equally. Your worth depended on your lineage, your gender, even your profession. A chief's son might equal a herd of cattle, a slave, maybe a goat. Equality before the law, not a thing. But here's the kicker: sometimes vengeance was non-negotiable. Among the Yanomami in the Amazon, for instance, retaliatory raids for deaths could spiral endlessly, each killing demanding another. It wasn't an eye for an eye. It was an eye, then a head, then 3 cousins, then a cycle of suspicion that could last generations. Your personal safety, a ticking clock, until someone decided the balance was still unsettled. And it didn't stop at death. Sometimes a feud could be settled by handing over a bride, forging peace through a human life reallocated into another family. Imagine being told that your cousin killed someone, and the solution is for you to marry into the victim's family as compensation. Suddenly your body is both a treaty and an apology note. Feuds weren't just about people, they were about cosmic balance. To leave a death unavenged was to invite chaos, weakness, dishonor. Communities believed the spirits of the dead might linger, restless, until repayment was made. Your worth wasn't just economic, it was spiritual. Someone had to close the account, or risk ancestral wrath, and this made everyone paranoid. A wrong look at a market, a fight over grazing land, a marriage gone sour could escalate into killings that demanded repayment. Whole villages lived under the quiet knowledge that every action might one day be weighed against someone's blood. You didn't just live your own life, you lived as a potential future pawn in a chess game of revenge. So, your life's value here wasn't fixed. It fluctuated, like cattle prices in a drought. You could be worth a fortune in animals if killed unjustly, or worth very little if your death was politically convenient. Either way, your existence was negotiable, measured in goats, beer, or the blade of a rival's spear. And if you thought that being born into the right family might protect you, think again. Because there was another way your life could be bought and sold, one that didn't involve blood or revenge at all. Adoption. Sometimes, instead of killing you, they'd simply decide to own you. So, imagine you've been captured in a raid. You're tied up, dragged back to camp, and you're fully expecting the worst death: slavery, or, if you're really unlucky, sacrifice duty at the next harvest festival. But then something stranger happens. Instead of killing you, they decide to keep you. Not as a slave, not as a hostage, but as family. Congratulations, you've just been adopted. Now, don't picture cozy modern adoption agencies with paperwork and teddy bears. This was anthropology's version of a hard reset. Across the world, from the Iroquois in North America to tribes in the Amazon and pastoralists in Africa, captives, especially children, were sometimes absorbed into families to replace lost members. Your worth wasn't in who you were, but in who you could become. Did someone's son die in a raid? Fine, you'll do. You're now their son. Don't argue. And this wasn't symbolic, it was binding. In the Iroquois Morning Wars, captured children were adopted into families that had lost kin. Once inside, you weren't treated as a prisoner. You were kin, sometimes with all the rights and duties of a blood relative. That meant protection, food, and status. Your old identity erased, your new one assigned on the spot. If anyone asked, you'd always been part of the family. History rewritten faster than a pharaoh chiseling out his predecessor's name. Of course, this process could be brutal. Adoption often came with rituals designed to cleanse you of your old life. Hair shaved, scars inflicted, new names given. In some cases, you were beaten or humiliated until your past self was considered destroyed. A rebirth, but not the gentle kind. Still, compared to being sacrificed or enslaved, this wasn't the worst outcome. In fact, adoption was often a strategic move for the community. Populations in small-scale societies were fragile. Famine, disease, raids all could wipe out dozens at once. Absorbing outsiders kept numbers steady, replenished labor forces, and healed the social wound of loss. Your life became valuable not because of who you were, but because of the empty space you could fill. And make no mistake, this wasn't always about kindness. It was pragmatism, dressed in kinship terms. An adopted child could carry on the lineage, provide for elders, and expand alliances. For the tribe, it was like plugging a gap in the roof. For you, it was survival, even if it meant living under a new name with memories you weren't allowed to speak of. But here's the eerie twist. Once adopted, you weren't halfway kin, you were all in. Killing you after that point would be taboo, because it would be killing a family member. In some cultures, even the spirits were expected to forget your old identity. The dead relative you replaced was considered at peace now, their place in the world patched with your living body. You were both replacement and continuity, one life swapped for another, in a kind of human accounting. So your worth here wasn't fixed or stable, it was conditional. One moment you were expendable, the next you were priceless, woven into the most sacred web of kinship. And yet, just because you'd been absorbed, didn't mean you were safe. Because there was another, colder kind of economy at work, one where human beings weren't adopted, but openly traded, like salt or cattle. So maybe you weren't sacrificed, or ransomed, or ceremonially beaten into someone else's replacement child. Lucky you. But don't exhale just yet, because there was another economy waiting, one even less sentimental, the open market. In many ancient societies, human beings weren't just kin or enemies, they were currency. Captives of war, orphans, debtors, these weren't seen as wasted mouths, they were commodities. Among pastoral groups in Africa, captives were traded for cattle. Along the Niger River, slaves became part of wider trade routes, exchanged for salt, iron, and textiles. In the Americas, especially among tribes along the Pacific Northwest, slaves were used as symbols of wealth, proof that a chief was rich enough to own people the way he owned cedar planks and canoes. Your body was both workforce and bragging right. And here's where it gets deliciously ironic. Humans were sometimes considered more portable than livestock. Cows could wander off, goats could starve in a drought, but a captive could walk, carry goods, reproduce, and still be bartered later. You weren't just alive, you were liquid assets. Imagine looking in the mirror and realizing you're basically a walking cow with hands. This didn't always mean long-term bondage. Sometimes you were a short-term trade item, passed from one group to another as part of peace deals or economic bargains. To the communities involved, this wasn't cruelty, it was practical. Labor was scarce, wealth was fragile, bodies filled the gap, and value wasn't uniform. A young man strong enough to fight or work the fields could fetch a high price. A woman of childbearing age might be valued for both labor and reproduction. Children were more adaptable, easier to absorb into new groups, and therefore often preferred. The old or sick, sorry, your resale value wasn't great. You were the dented pottery of the human marketplace. This was more than barter, it was politics. Owning or trading humans wasn't just about utility, it was about status. Chiefs and leaders demonstrated power through the number of dependents they controlled. The more people under your authority, the greater your prestige. And yes, that included those you'd acquired through capture or trade. Your worth could be stacked like trophies in someone else's reputation. It's unsettling to think about, but human lives circulated in the same channels as shells, beads, or iron. The very same object, say, a strand of cowrie shells, might buy you grain in one village and a human being in another. That meant your life's price could shift wildly depending on geography, famine, or the whims of trade networks. In other words, you were subject to inflation. And don't think distance made you safer. Expanding trade routes meant captives could be shipped far from their origin. Once you were out of your homeland, your chance of ransom evaporated. You were no longer a person who belonged anywhere. You were an asset, moving through invisible hands. So your value here wasn't symbolic or familial, it was transactional. You were worth however much iron, salt, or cattle someone else was willing to give up for you. And if that sounds brutal, remember, in the ancient world, survival was economics, and economics didn't care about feelings. But here's the darker truth. Not everyone stayed valuable forever. Age had a funny way of shrinking your worth, because once you couldn't herd, haul, or reproduce, your price tag began to nosedive. And in lean times, the elderly sometimes learned just how expendable a human life could become. So far, your life has been measured in cows, shells, revenge debts, and the occasional possibility of being sacrificed to ensure the rain gods show up on time. But here's the inconvenient truth. Human value had an expiration date. As you aged, your worth didn't always climb with wisdom. It often dropped like a clay pot off a ledge. Now, to be fair, elders weren't universally dismissed. In many hunter-gatherer groups, older members carried something irreplaceable: memory. They knew where the waterholes were in drought years, which plants cured stomach rot, which trails were safe when neighboring clans were in a killing mood. Anthropologists have noted that oral tradition songs, stories, genealogies were libraries stored in human heads. Elders were walking archives, and losing one could mean losing centuries of knowledge. In that sense, some old lives were beyond price. But here's the other side. Wisdom doesn't plow fields or chase antelope. When resources tightened, the elderly were often weighed against survival math. In famine, some cultures practiced cenocide, deliberate abandonment, or killing of the old, when food was scarce. The Inuit have tales of elders walking alone onto the ice, quietly stepping out of the food chain so younger bellies could stay full. In Japan, the folkloric tale of Ubisut tells of elderly women carried to mountaintops to die when resources ran short. And in parts of northern Europe, sagas speak of old men leaping from cliffs to avoid burdening their kin. These weren't acts of cruelty in their context, they were framed as duty. Your value wasn't measured in affection, but in calories saved. Even when not abandoned, elders could feel their worth slipping. You couldn't haul wood, you couldn't herd goats, you couldn't produce children. At best, you taught and advised. At worst, you ate more than you contributed. And in harsh environments, that made you vulnerable to being quietly forgotten when the group moved on. Still, decline wasn't uniform. In agricultural societies, where food surpluses cushioned survival, elders often retained influence. They controlled property, land, or ritual knowledge. A grandmother might oversee marriages. A grandfather might preside over disputes. In those cases, your value lay not in your back muscles but in your authority. In fact, sometimes old age elevated you. You became the gatekeeper of tradition, the voice of the ancestors, the one who decided how bride price or feuds were settled. Your wrinkled skin became symbolic capital, but symbolism could only carry so far. When bodhis failed and famine struck, even sacred elders could be quietly reclassified as expendable. That eerie paradox, priceless when wise, disposable when weak, was the tightrope of old age in ancient tribes. And yes, some communities revered elders even in hardship, believing that abandoning them would anger the spirits. But that reverence wasn't universal. The calculus was always the same. Can you help us survive? If not, can your death help us survive? So, your life's worth here wasn't about equality or sentiment. It was about whether your existence tipped the balance of survival in the right direction. One day, you might be the tribal historian, the source of sacred lore. The next, you might be the extra mouth nobody could afford to feed. And just when you thought it couldn't get more precarious, imagine being captured or raided in your old age. You weren't going to be adopted. You weren't going to fetch a bride price. You might be traded like an object, or simply discarded, because your resale value had already plummeted. So, you've aged into wisdom, or maybe just into creaky knees. But don't get too comfortable, because there was always another way your life's worth could be recalculated. Raids. In tribal worlds, raids were as common as bad weather. Sometimes it was about cattle, sometimes about honor, sometimes about sheer boredom, but often it was about people. And that meant your body, once again, was negotiable. Picture it. Dawn breaks, the air still cold, and suddenly your camp is on fire. Neighbors or enemies, depending on whose side you ask, storm in. They don't kill everyone. Why would they? Dead bodies don't fetch cows. Live ones do. And just like that, you're captured, tied up, and marched off. Your value isn't in your name, your skills, or your witty sense of humor. It's in how much your kin are willing or able to pay to get you back. This wasn't some Backley ransom note scrawled on papyrus. It was an entire system. Across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, captives were bargaining chips in negotiations between groups. A child taken in a raid might be returned in exchange for goats, a chief's son. Now we're talking herds of cattle, bolts of cloth, maybe even iron weapons. Your life was literally an invoice waiting to be paid, and it wasn't just economic, it was political. Hostages kept peace between rival groups. You might be married off into your captor's clan as a living treaty, your body sealing a fragile truce. Some tribes demanded periodic exchanges of people to maintain alliances. Imagine being used as a walking promise not to start a war. Forget signing treaties, you were the treaty. Of course, ransom wasn't always guaranteed. If your family was poor or your kinship network weak, you might rot in captivity or be traded on to someone else. Among pastoralists, your price could fluctuate with the season. In drought years, captives were worth less. In times of abundance, more. You were subject to the same brutal economics as sheep and salt. Inflation applied to your life too. And don't assume ransom meant a quick reunion. Sometimes negotiations dragged on for years, with captives stuck in limbo, living half-lives in camps that weren't their own. A lucky few integrated, adopted by new kin groups. Others were killed when ransom failed or if politics shifted. Your life was a poker chip on a table you never asked to sit at. The eerie part is that raids weren't always about need. Sometimes they were tradition. Among the Comanche, raiding was practically a rite of passage, a way to prove manhood and acquire wealth, including human wealth. Among Vikings, the same story. Raids weren't accidents, they were business models. Human beings were simply high-value loot. So, in a world where raids and ransom were routine, your life was never entirely your own. You lived at the mercy of other people's conflicts, other people's debts, other people's politics. And every dawn, you might wake up wondering, will today be the day my body gets reclassified as someone else's property? And if you thought violence and captivity were the only threats, think again. Sometimes your worth wasn't stolen in a raid, it was whittled away slowly, by famine or disease, until even the healthiest life could be recalculated as expendable. If raids and ransom didn't get you, something quieter often did, disease or hunger. Because in tribal worlds, your life's worth wasn't just balanced against enemies or politics. It was constantly renegotiated against the most merciless forces of epidemics and famine. Let's start with scarcity. Food was the ultimate currency, and when it ran short, human value shifted fast. A healthy young adult, a kind who could hunt, herd, or bear children, was priceless. But the very young, the very old, or the chronically sick, their worth could plummet overnight. In some hunter-gatherer societies, infants were quietly abandoned during lean years, not because parents didn't care, but because the tribe couldn't afford the calorie debt. In famine, every bite of food became a brutal equation. Who can transform this grain, this tuber, this meat into the most survival? If you didn't make the cut, the math wasn't in your favor. And then there was disease, the invisible raider. Small-scale societies weren't immune to plagues. Contact with new groups could spread pathogens that swept through camps like fire through dry grass. Archaeologists have found evidence of mass burials in early farming villages, clusters of skeletons, suggesting epidemics wiped out entire communities. In those moments, a single life's worth was reframed again. Survivors became more precious because numbers were scarce, but the sick, often avoided, shunned, or even killed, their lives treated as dangerous liabilities. Among the Inuit, stories tell of groups abandoning those struck by illness to protect the healthy. In ancient farming communities, skeletal remains show signs of neglect and diseased bodies wasting, bones thinning as if the ill had been cut off from food. Not cruelty, again, but cold treatment. Survival meant someone's worth was measured not by who they were, but by whether they could outlast the fever. Scarcity could even reshape morality. Practices we find shocking, infanticide, abandonment, selective feeding, weren't always evil acts, but survival strategies. A mother might favor the healthier child with milk if famine struck. A tribe might decide that feeding warriors came before feeding the old. These weren't heartless decisions, they were the math of staying alive in a world where nature was always trying to kill you. The eerie thing is how elastic value could be. The same person who was expendable during famine might, in times of plenty, be cherished as a source of songs, stories, or fertility. Worth wasn't fixed. It expanded and shrank with the harvest. You were priceless one year, disposable the next. Imagine knowing your very survival wasn't about your soul or your dignity, but about the yield of millet or the number of caribou crossing the tundra. And yet, scarcity also heightened the symbolic worth of life. Deaths in famine were often ritualized, turned into stories of sacrifice or divine punishment. The dead weren't just mourned, they were explained, because when food vanished, people needed to believe it wasn't random. Your death became folded into cosmology, whether as a warning from spirits, a test from gods, or a debt to ancestors. Even in expendability, humans found a way to give value back to lives lost. So, under famine and plague, your life wasn't really yours. It was an item on nature's balance sheet, reassessed every season, every harvest, every outbreak. And if disease or scarcity didn't claim you outright, there was still another way your worth could be measured, through your place in the spiritual ledger, as a link to ancestors and the unseen. By now you've been priced in cattle, traded for salt, abandoned in famine, and maybe even held hostage for someone else's mistakes. But there's one more economy you couldn't escape, even in death, the spiritual one. Because in tribal societies, your worth wasn't just about what you could do while breathing, it was about what you meant once you stopped. See, every life carried more than muscle and calories. You were also a vessel of spirits, ancestors, and invisible debts. In many cultures, children weren't just new mouths. They were reincarnations of dead relatives. Among the Yoruba, newborns could be recognized as returning ancestors, their features or quirks read as signs of who had come back. That meant your existence wasn't only valued in labor terms, it was cosmic recycling. You weren't just you were Grandma 2.0, expected to carry on her unfinished business, hopefully without the arthritis and death. Death didn't erase worth, it inflated it. The dead became ancestors, and ancestors wielded enormous power. If your body wasn't buried properly, your spirit could become restless, bringing sickness, bad luck, or crop failure. Entire rituals, sometimes elaborate and costly, existed just to keep your ghost happy. Your worth in life might have been measured in goats, but in death it was measured in how terrified people were of your afterlife tantrums. This meant funerals were not optional, they were investments. In West African societies, elaborate funerals weren't just mourning ceremonies. They were transactions ensuring the dead didn't turn vengeful. Among the Toraja in Indonesia, people saved 4 years to host funerals, sacrificing buffalo to send their relatives off properly. A person's worth was now in how many animals could be slaughtered in their name, a posthumous conversion of wealth into cosmic insurance. And don't think the living got off easy. Ancestors demanded constant upkeep offerings of food, beer, or smoke. Forget to honor them, and your harvest might fail. In ancient China, ancestral tablets kept the names of the dead alive, because a forgotten ancestor was a dangerous one. Here, worth was measured not in cows or shells, but in memory. To be remembered was to remain valuable. To be forgotten was annihilation. Even your bones carried weight. Archaeologists have found skulls preserved in caves, decorated, or displayed in homes. These weren't creepy decorations, they were guarantees. Each bone was a token of continuity, proof that the living were still tethered to the dead. Your skeleton was a kind of spiritual collateral. And here's the irony. People who in life were marginalized, the weak, the sick, the expendable, could in death hold entire communities hostage through fear of their restless spirits. In life you were a burden. In death you could ruin harvests. Talk about a career upgrade. So your worth here wasn't about economics or politics, but about cosmology. You mattered not only for what you did, but for how well you kept the invisible order intact. Your body, your memory, your ghostal were assets or liabilities in a world where the living and the dead shared the same ledger. But just because you were revered as ancestor material didn't mean your body was safe. Because sometimes the spiritual worth of your life could be turned into hard currency again. When people decided your memory wasn't enough, they needed your body traded, stolen, or paraded for ransom. So here we are at the end of the line. You've been a newborn investment, a child laborer, a gendered tool, a bloodline placeholder, a captive, a bride price, a ransom note, and if unlucky, a divine offering. You'd think death might finally let you off the hook. But no. Because in many ancient tribes, your worth didn't vanish with your last breath. It lingered, twisted, sometimes inflated, sometimes erased, long after your body was in the ground. Legacy was a dangerous currency. To be remembered meant you lived on in song, story, and ritual. To be forgotten meant you ceased to exist altogether. In ancient Egypt, to have your name erased from monuments was spiritual murder. You didn't just die, you were deleted. And while that's empire-level drama, smaller tribes practiced their own versions. Names of ancestors were recited at rituals. If yours dropped from the list, you vanished from cosmic memory. Your afterlife wasn't guaranteed by your deeds, it was guaranteed by whether people still said your name around the fire. Sometimes legacy inflated value beyond recognition. A warrior who died young might become legendary, his story exaggerated until he was half man. In the Pacific Northwest, potlatch ceremonies involved chiefs giving away slaves and goods to increase their reputation. The more they gave, the greater their name. Legacy was an economy where generosity or ostentation measured human worth. But it could go the other way. In many societies, the dead were stripped of prestige by rivals. Stories got retold, details adjusted. That embarrassing defeat in battle, reframed as a glorious last stand. That selfish hoarding of food during famine, quietly erased from memory. Your worth wasn't just what you did, it was what later generations found useful to remember. You were a narrative asset, edited for political convenience. And then there's the practical side. Bodies as legacy. Mummies, bog bodies, skull shrines. Archaeologists keep stumbling over corpses that weren't left to rot quietly. They were displayed, preserved, worshipped, or even paraded. Your body wasn't yours. It was property of the living, leveraged as proof of continuity, legitimacy, or power. Even your fingernails might end up catalogued in some future museum. Your remains reduced to display cases and keychains. That's not immortality, it's branding. Legacy also meant that your worth could shift centuries later. Tribes that once considered you a great leader might later retell your story as cautionary tale. Or, more ironically, you might end up immortalized by outsiders, archaeologists, anthropologists, travel bloggers, people who pronounced your name wrong while writing you into history. You became valuable again, not for what you were, but for what someone else wanted you to symbolize. So the legacy of human worth in ancient tribes wasn't about timeless honor. It was fragile, negotiable, constantly rewritten. A life could end up sacred, erased, commodified, or forgotten depending on how memory and power aligned. Your greatest reward for surviving the brutal math of survival. To have your existence reinterpreted by people who never met you, bending your life into whatever shape they needed. And that's the final irony. In ancient tribes, the worth of a human life was never fixed. From birth to death to memory, you were a shifting number in someone else's ledger. Economic, spiritual, political. Even today, when archaeologists dust your bones and display them under fluorescent lights, your value hasn't stopped being recalculated. You were priceless, expendable, sacred, and negotiable all at once. So if you ever feel like modern life reduces you to a resume line or a data point, take comfort. You're in good company. People have been priced, traded, remembered, and forgotten since the beginning. Human worth was always a currency, just one that kept changing the exchange rate. In the beginning, defeat on the battlefield didn't always mean a quick death. For many societies, killing an enemy outright was wasteful. Corpses don't haul grain, they don't tend fires, they don't build fences or paddles or temples. Dead enemies rot. Living enemies can be turned into something else: property, labor, prestige, even ritual offerings. And so a shift occurred, quiet but practical. The spear didn't always strike to kill, it struck to capture. Archaeological traces tell the story clearly. In Mesopotamian reliefs, rows of kneeling prisoners marched behind chariots, their hands bound, their heads bowed. Victory wasn't measured just in corpse size, was counted in captives. Across Africa, pastoral groups raided not simply to destroy but to take women, children, livestock, and men who could be forced to work. In North America, tribes like the Iroquois waged what were called mourning wars, designed less to annihilate and more to replenish the living. Capturing was as important as killing, sometimes more so. And this wasn't compassionate, was economics. Every human being represented stored energy: arms for labor, wombs for children, mouths to speak languages, recite myths, sing songs. Capturing meant converting enemies into resources. It was the equivalent of looting a chest of tools that also happened to breathe and bleed. In societies without machines, each body was a machine in itself. Why smash it when you could redirect it? Of course, capture changed the theater of war. A raid wasn't just a clash of spears and arrows, it was a harvest. The battlefield became less about annihilation and more about acquisition. Women were pulled from villages, children taken on long marches, men bound and beaten but kept alive. The brutality wasn't diminished, was simply repurposed. The goal wasn't mercy but utility. This shift can be glimpsed in ritual too. In Maya inscriptions, captives are depicted not only as victims of execution but as trophies, paraded before the gods and the people. Their living presence was the proof of victory, more valuable than their blood. The Aztecs codified this into ritual. Battles specifically designed to capture enemies for sacrifice, not to kill them outright in the field. Death was postponed so that value could be extracted first as spectacle, then as offering. Even in the Old World, the logic held. The Assyrians built empires on it, resettling entire populations instead of slaughtering them, spreading skills, labor, and loyalty across their territories. The defeated weren't erased, they were redistributed, transformed into the scaffolding of empire. Their survival wasn't kindness, it was control. What emerges from these patterns is a strange, unsettling pragmatism. The enemy was both despised and needed, cursed and cultivated. The defeated body was too valuable to waste. A dead enemy made for a moment of triumph. A living enemy could be turned into a lifetime of use, whether as slave, servant, wife, or sacrifice. In a sense, capture made war more grotesque, because it meant the violence didn't end on the battlefield. It simply changed shape, continuing in households, temples, and fields. And once the spear stopped aiming for the heart and started aiming for the wrists, an entire system unfolded around what to do with the captured body. The first and most obvious path was labor. The defeated became workers, forced into fields, kitchens, and quarries. Their lives converted into hours of sweat. And so the transformation of enemy into property began in earnest. Once the decision was made to keep enemies alive, the next question was obvious: what to do with them? The answer was as old as conquest itself: work them. Slavery wasn't an invention of vast empires. It was present in small-scale societies long before the pyramids or plantations. A defeated enemy became a pair of hands, stripped of autonomy, absorbed into the daily grind of survival. Archaeological fragments hint at the ubiquity of this practice. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia record lists of slaves alongside grain rations. Their identities collapsed into numbers and quotas. In Africa's pastoral zones, captives herded cattle, drew water, built fences. Among tribes of the Pacific Northwest, slaves were status symbols, proof that a chief had wealth, not only in cedar and salmon, but in human bodies. Everywhere the same pattern appears: the vanquished converted into labor units. The labor itself was rarely glamorous. Agricultural slavery meant endless days bent over fields, planting and harvesting crops that would never feed the laborer's own family. In domestic contexts, captives ground grain, cooked food, fetched water, carried wood. Every mundane necessity of tribal life was pushed onto the bodies of the defeated. And if a new canal needed digging or a wall needed raising, The weakest backs were the first chosen. But this was more than physical. Slavery also carried a symbolic weight. To own the bodies of others was to display power. Among the Quack slaves were sometimes killed in potlatch ceremonies. Their deaths proof that a chief's wealth was so abundant he could afford to waste human lives. Here the defeated body was both tool and spectacle. A reminder that conquest didn't end at the battlefield, but followed the captive into every corner of existence. For women, the lines blurred between labor and reproduction. A captured woman might be forced into marriage. Her fertility as valuable as her hands. She wasn't simply property. She was a mechanism for swelling the victor's lineage. Children born of captives carried the dual legacy of defeat and absorption, expanding the tribe's numbers while erasing the captive's old identity. The womb became another kind of field, another form of labor extracted from the conquered. And it wasn't just brute force. Systems grew around managing this labor. In some pastoral societies, slaves were traded like livestock, their worth calculated in cows or goats. In others, captives were integrated into kinship networks but kept permanently subordinate. They might eat at the same fire, but their names, their rights, their futures were always constrained. The enemy was domesticated, like an animal brought in from the wild, never fully trusted, always marked as other. The eerie irony lies in the sheer normality of it. Slavery wasn't considered a moral failing, it was routine. Communities that depended on every able body still found ways to classify some bodies as less than human, extracting their work while stripping their dignity. It was practical, brutal, and entirely normalized. Yet even within this grim system, another possibility emerged. Some captives weren't left to toil endlessly at the bottom. Instead, they were absorbed, reborn into new identities, folded into the kinship fabric through adoption. Their labor wasn't only in fields or kitchens. It was in the delicate work of filling gaps left by the dead. Not every captive was condemned to a lifetime of grinding grain or hauling water under someone else's command. In many societies, defeat didn't end in permanent subjugation, but in a kind of forced rebirth. The enemy could be absorbed, reclassified, and made kin. Adoption wasn't sentimental, it was strategic, a way of repairing the holes torn in the tribe's fabric by war and death. The Iroquois practiced this with startling regularity. Their so-called morning wars weren't designed to exterminate neighbors, but to replenish their own. If a clan lost members, captives were brought back to replace them. Children were particularly valuable, stripped of their old names, given new ones, and raised as if they had always belonged. The memory of their previous life was erased with ritual. Some accounts describe captives being cleansed, beaten, even scarified before being declared reborn. Pain marked the border between old identity and new. The psychology behind it was as pragmatic as it was eerie. The dead left holes in labor, in kinship, in ritual continuity. Captives could be stuffed into those gaps like living patches. A slain brother could be replaced by a captured enemy, who, after ritual transformation, was treated as the brother resurrected. In this sense, adoption wasn't kindness, it was substitution. Among Amazonian tribes, similar patterns appeared. Captured children were taken in, their languages gradually stripped away, their loyalties redirected. By adolescence, they no longer belonged to the people they had come from. Memory blurred, identity shifted. Enemies became family, and their children's children had no trace of foreignness. What began as forced assimilation ended in full absorption, strengthening the group's numbers. Even in Africa, pastoral and agricultural groups used adoption to transform enemies into assets. Captured women and children could be fully integrated, sometimes rising in status over generations. An outsider became insider, not by choice but by necessity, because communities' new survival often depended on swelling ranks after losses. The boundary between us and them was never fixed. It was adjustable, redrawn in blood and ceremony. But this process wasn't without cruelty. To erase an identity, you had to dismantle it. Captives often endured symbolic deaths, ritual humiliations, renaming, even mutilation to prove their break from the past. Some were forced to witness the destruction of their old belongings, or to repeat oaths denouncing their former kin. It wasn't enough to be physically present, they had to be spiritually rewritten. Still, once absorbed, the transformation could be permanent. A child raised from infancy might never know they weren't born into the clan. They would grow, marry, reproduce, and pass on traditions as if they had always been part of them. The enemy's bloodline, once a threat, was converted into continuity. The defeated became indistinguishable from the victors. This practice also reveals a strange fluidity in tribal concepts of identity. Kinship wasn't simply biology. It was performance, memory, and ritual affirmation. If the group agreed you were one of them, then you would, and if the group demanded you forget who you had been, you did. So while many captives broke their backs in fields or kitchens, others were folded into households as sons, daughters, or spouses. Their labor wasn't only physical, it was genealogical. They carried forward the lives of the dead, living continuations of people erased in battle. But not every captive became kin. Some, especially women, were valued for another purpose entirely, not just as adoptees, but as wives, concubines, or reproductive assets. Here, absorption took on a distinctly marital shape. For many captives, assimilation didn't come in the form of symbolic rebirth or ritual renaming. It came through marriage or, to be blunt, through being reassigned as reproductive property. Defeated enemies, especially women, often crossed into new tribes, not by choice but by obligation. Their fertility transformed into political capital. Across Africa, bride capture was not uncommon, and though later romanticized in oral traditions, it was closer to calculated strategy than impulsive theft. Women taken in raids were married into the victor's group, not as tokens of affection, but as tools of alliance building. Their wombs secured continuity, their children strengthened bloodlines, and their presence tied formerly hostile families together in uneasy bonds. Fertility, here, was worth more than gold. Among pastoralists like the Maasai or the Dinka, women represented wealth in two currencies: the bride price they might fetch, and the children they would bear. A captured woman bypassed the first, but delivered the second. Her body filled the gap in lineage expansion, her labor carried out in household and field, her identity absorbed through the inevitable birth of children who belonged not to her old clan, but to her new masters. The Vikings, too, practiced this logic in their raids across Europe. Women were abducted, carried back on ships, and folded into Norse households, where their foreign origins quickly faded beneath the demands of domesticity and childbirth. Their bodies became the quiet engines of demographic expansion, binding distant conquests to the hearth. Even in societies where captives were formerly enslaved, marriage blurred the lines. Concubinage was common in Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. A female captive might be a servant by status, yet her children could still rise within the family, even inheriting property if acknowledged by the father. Here, marriage wasn't a ceremony, it was a transaction, reshaping power and ensuring that defeat translated into reproduction. But the union was rarely symmetrical. For men captured in war, marriage was not the usual fate. Instead, their value lay in labor or sacrifice. Marriage alliances almost exclusively absorbed women, because women were the reproductive bottleneck. One woman could bear only so many children, so every womb was precious. Raids that brought women home alive were victories measured not only in cattle or spoils, but in the long-term expansion of households. This practice wasn't seen as strange or cruel. It was practical. Marriage to a captive wasn't a deviation from the norm, it was one of the ways lineage was secured. Communities justified it with ritual, presenting unions as blessed by spirits or sanctioned by gods. But beneath the ceremony, the reality was pragmatic. The defeated woman was property converted into kin, her body inscribed into the victor's genealogy, whether she wished it or not. And yet, within this grim arithmetic, there was also transformation. Children of these marriages often blurred the distinction between conqueror and captive. After one or two generations, the memory of conquest was buried under kinship ties, the past reimagined as destiny. In this sense, marriage was both violence and erasure. It scarred the present but rewrote the future. Still, not every captive was folded into households and alliances. Some were too valuable to be married away, too politically charged to disappear into kinship. They were kept visible, paraded as living proof of victory, displayed like human trophies to magnify the prestige of those who owned them. Defeated enemies weren't always hidden away in kitchens or quietly folded into lineages. Sometimes they were meant to be seen publicly, conspicuously, paraded like living banners of triumph. Captives could become tribute, moving symbols of a conqueror's wealth and power, their very existence a form of spectacle. Mesopotamian stone carvings show this with almost obsessive detail. Long lines of bound prisoners led behind victorious kings, their heads bowed, their hair gripped like leashes by soldiers. The message wasn't subtle. It told the world, look what we can do. These lives are ours now. The captives themselves were less important than the display of them, living props in a political theater where humiliation was currency. In the Pacific Northwest, chiefs measured status by how many slaves they could control, not for labor alone but for the prestige of ownership. The ability to discard a human life in a potlatch ceremony, to kill a slave as casually as slaughtering a pig proved wealth, so excessive it bordered on cosmic arrogance. Prestige, in these societies, wasn't about accumulation alone. It was about the ability to waste extravagantly. To sacrifice property, even human property, was the highest proof that one had more than enough. The Romans perfected the idea on a grand scale. Triumphs, those elaborate victory parades through the streets of Rome always featured chained enemies at the front. Kings, generals, entire families dragged through the crowd, their humiliation feeding the roar of the city. Sometimes they were executed at the end of the procession, sometimes enslaved, but always displayed first. Victory wasn't just told, it was shown, embodied in defeated bodies, made to walk the gauntlet of public scorn. Even in smaller societies, captives could serve as tribute to chiefs or elders. A conquered village might send people as living taxes, handed over not only to lighten the victor's burdens, but to reinforce hierarchy. Owning others wasn't just useful, it was proof of superiority. The defeated became the human equivalent of gold chains or carved thrones, status symbols meant to be seen and envied. The eerie thing is how normalized this was. Captives weren't treated as people paraded against their will. They were assets displayed in inventory, their identities erased, their worth redefined entirely by their visibility. They were no longer enemies, nor even individuals. They were trophies, the breathing punctuation marks at the end of a sentence that said, "We won, you lost, and here's the evidence." And prestige wasn't always limited to warriors or chiefs. Families who took in captives sometimes showcased them too, subtly or overtly, as marks of prosperity. A household with slaves was a household of standing. A man who had wives taken in raids displayed dominance, not only over his household but over neighboring clans. The more lives under your control, the more impressive your place in the world. But prestige was fragile. If captives were too valuable, they risked being reclaimed through ransom. If too visible, they might incite resentment or revolt. So the spectacle of ownership always carried tension. Every trophy was also a reminder of unfinished violence, and sometimes the balance tipped. Captives paraded as symbols of power could suddenly shift roles, no longer trophies but bargaining chips. When politics demanded, these same lives became negotiable assets in the delicate game of ransom and negotiation. For all the spectacle of parading captives, sometimes their greatest value wasn't in humiliation or labor, but in leverage. A living enemy could be a bargaining chip, a pawn in the delicate, often cynical game of tribal politics, and that meant ransom. Across the ancient world, captives were less often executed than modern imaginations suppose. Killing ended their usefulness. Keeping them alive opened doors. Among pastoral groups in East Africa, hostages were common in intertribal feuds. A raid might seize cattle and people, and while the cattle could be eaten or absorbed, the people were negotiable. Families of the captured offered livestock, iron, beads, or land in exchange. The worth of a life was whatever someone else was willing and able to pay, and not all lives were priced equally. A child from a poor family might be traded back for a few goats. A chief's son, however, could be worth entire herds. Ransom didn't just measure the value of a person, it measured the weight of their kinship network. The more powerful your family, the higher your price, and the more dangerous your captivity became. Because while your ransom might be lucrative, you were also leverage in ongoing disputes. The Vikings understood this perfectly. Their raids across Europe weren't just smash-and-grab affairs. They were sophisticated kidnapping enterprises. Monks, nobles, wealthy townsfolk all dragged back to longships, not to be killed but to be ransomed. The ransom trade was so profitable, it became a cornerstone of Norse expansion. Better to have a hostage whose family could pay than a corpse with no value beyond a story. In Mesoamerica, too, captives could be ransomed rather than sacrificed, especially if they came from politically significant families. To kill a noble outright was to waste an opportunity. To hold them, negotiate, and extract tribute was more useful. Death was dramatic. Ransom was profitable. But ransom wasn't always a clean transaction. Sometimes captives lingered in limbo, held for years while negotiations dragged on. They lived half-lives, neither fully enslaved nor fully free, waiting for the right number of goats or jars of beer to be agreed upon. And if no payment came, their fate shifted. They might be absorbed into the community, enslaved permanently, or killed as a last resort. Their value expired, like a contract left unsigned. The eerie paradox here is that captivity could preserve life. Being too important to kill meant survival, at least for a time. But it also meant your existence was reduced to numbers, your body equated with livestock, your future dependent on negotiations you couldn't control. To live was to remain suspended in someone else's politics. Ransom also acted as diplomacy. Hostages weren't only captured, they were exchanged deliberately to guarantee peace. A chief might hand over his own son as surety, trusting that the boy's life ensured compliance on both sides. Here, the enemy wasn't just property, he was insurance, the living embodiment of a fragile truce. But insurance has a cost. Hostages lived under constant suspicion, never fully trusted. Their worth bound to the stability of agreements that could collapse at any time. A broken treaty could mean their death. A new alliance might return them home. Their lives fluctuated like markets, tethered to the volatile currents of politics and trust. And yet, ransom and negotiation still belonged to the realm of the living. Some captives were spared for work, others for bargaining. But others were kept alive only to die later because, in some societies, the defeated enemy wasn't meant to be exchanged or integrated at all. They were destined to be offerings, transformed into sacred currency for gods and ancestors. Not every captive was meant for ransom, labor, or marriage. Some were kept alive precisely so they could die. In many societies, the defeated enemy's ultimate value was as an offering sacrificed not to humans, but to gods. Here, the body became currency in the cosmic economy. The Aztecs are the most famous practitioners, and for good reason. Their so-called flower wars weren't designed to conquer territory, but to capture enemies alive. Warriors trained not to kill but to wound, to drag opponents back for later sacrifice. On temple steps, the captives' hearts were cut out, their blood offered to the sun. Their bodies sometimes cast down the pyramid to remind everyone watching that life itself was negotiable. For the Aztecs, the sun's rising depended on this bargain. Enemies weren't just defeated, they were fuel for the cosmos. The Inca carried their own logic, different but equally unsettling. In the Copeco rituals, chosen children often captured or pledged as tribute from conquered provinces were led up high Andean peaks, drugged with chicha beer or coca, and buried alive. They weren't punished but honored, selected precisely because they were unblemished, beautiful, and young. Their deaths sanctified the state, appeased mountain spirits, and tied the empire together in rituals of shared sacrifice. Here, defeat wasn't even necessary. Tribute could come in the form of one's most perfect children, given willingly or under imperial pressure. Farther afield, ritual sacrifice was no less present. Bog bodies uncovered in northern Europe like Toland Man or Grobel Man suggest ritual killings where victims, possibly captives, were strangled, stabbed, or drowned, then placed in peat bogs as offerings. Their preservation is eerie, faces serene, hair intact, as if they were meant to linger forever as witnesses to the pact between humans and gods. In West Africa, sacrificial practices often targeted war captives. At the installation of new kings or during droughts, human lives were given to ancestors or deities to secure legitimacy or reign. Captives became political offerings, their deaths woven into the continuity of the community. The enemy's blood sanctified the ruler's power, transforming defeat into divine approval. What's striking is how sacrifice made captives more valuable alive than dead in battle. Killing them on the field yielded nothing but corpses. Capturing them transformed their bodies into offerings that could feed gods, secure reign, guaranteed victory. The worth of the enemy lay not in their survival, but in their ritual death. And yet, these killings weren't seen as cruelty by those who performed them. They were necessity. Communities genuinely believed the cosmos needed payment, that spirits demanded balance, that floods or droughts or defeats were consequences of unpaid debts. To sacrifice was to maintain order, to stabilize the fragile bridge between humans and the divine. In that sense, captives weren't just offerings, they were insurance policies against cosmic collapse. But of course, sacrifice didn't end the enemy's usefulness. In some cultures, their deaths were followed by yet another transformation into food. The defeated could be consumed, their flesh eaten in ritual meals designed to absorb their strength, which meant that sometimes captives didn't just belong to gods. They became property of the stomach. If sacrifice turned captives into offerings for the gods, cannibalism took the logic one step further. The defeated enemy became nourishment. Across parts of the world, enemies weren't only killed, they were eaten. And while modern ears recoil at the thought, the practice wasn't random savagery. It followed its own grim anthropology of meaning. In Melanesia, ritual cannibalism was both pragmatic and symbolic. The flesh of enemies was consumed not for taste but for power. To eat a body was to absorb its essence, to swallow courage, strength, or vitality. In some groups of Papua New Guinea, consuming an enemy was a way of unmaking him completely. Death alone wasn't enough. His body had to vanish into the bellies of the victors, recycled as strength for the living. In the Amazon, similar logics applied. Among the Tupinamba captured warriors were ritually killed and their flesh consumed in ceremonies that were as much about humiliation as nourishment. The meal wasn't ordinary. It was staged, sung about, witnessed. Eating the enemy was the final punctuation of victory, turning his life into a feast of triumph. What he had once been a threat, a warrior, a rival, was dismantled bite by bite, until nothing remained but memory. The Aztecs, too, have been recorded as practicing cannibalism, though scholars still debate the scale. After sacrifices on temple tops, portions of flesh were sometimes distributed among the elite. Again, this wasn't about diet turkeys and maize fed the people. The ritual meal was about hierarchy and cosmic order. To eat the body of the defeated was to participate in the divine recycling of life, to show that nothing in victory was wasted. Even in Europe, echoes exist. Medieval chronicles describe accusations of cannibalism among barbarian groups, though often these reports were propaganda. Yet archaeological evidence, like cut marks on human bones from prehistoric Europe, suggests that ritual cannibalism had been practiced long before. The line between horror and holiness was thinner than we imagine. It's worth noting that cannibalism wasn't always limited to enemies. Sometimes it was funerary, the eating of one's own dead as an act of reverence, consuming loved ones so their spirit would live within the community. But with enemies, the logic was harsher. Consumption stripped them of individuality, denied them burial, erased their presence from the world of the living and the dead. It was annihilation made edible. To outsiders, this reads as grotesque. To insiders, it was deeply rational. In worlds where strength was scarce, why waste the essence of a defeated warrior? Why leave power to rot in the ground when it could be ingested, transformed, and made part of the victors themselves? It was ecology at its most brutal, nothing wasted, everything recycled. Cannibalism, then, wasn't a deviation from the system of ownership, it was the endpoint. Enemies captured, paraded, sacrificed, finally consumed. Their value extracted on every level: labor, prestige, ritual, flesh. They became property not just of victors or gods, but of stomachs, veins, muscles. The conquered life circulated in new bodies, its worth redistributed in literal digestion. And yet, the act wasn't always quiet or hidden. It was staged, displayed, turned into performance. Cannibalism wasn't simply eating, it was theater, a ritual of fear and belonging, reminding everyone watching what it meant to be victorious and what it meant to be defeated. But of course, consumption was only one kind of theater. In many societies, captives who weren't eaten were still killed publicly, their deaths performed like plays. Death itself became spectacle, an offering not of flesh but of fear. When captives weren't ransomed, enslaved, married off, or consumed, they were often staged. Death itself became a performance, an act carefully curated to make the living pay attention. The execution of enemies was rarely private. It was spectacle, ritual, and lesson rolled into one. Among the Aztecs, captives marched up pyramid steps, not to be quietly dispatched, but to be displayed in public sacrifice. Thousands gathered to watch as priests raised obsidian blades, chants echoing across the city. Every movement was deliberate, every drop of blood part of a cosmic script. The victim's body wasn't only offered to the gods, it was offered to the eyes of the crowd, imprinting fear, awe and obedience into everyone present. In Northern Europe, bog bodies whisper similar stories. Men strangled, stabbed, or bludgeoned, then sunk into wetlands, their deaths marked by ritual gestures. Tolland man, with his serene face, seems almost posed, preserved for millennia, as if death were intended to be an eternal exhibit. The violence was symbolic triple killings, combining hanging, cutting, drowning gestures, less about practicality than about performance. The execution was theater for gods and spirits, but also for the community who remembered it. Elsewhere, executions of captives functioned as public warnings. Among some Native American groups, enemies might be burned, tortured, or ritually mutilated, not simply to kill but to dramatize conquest. The pain was elongated, the scene carefully observed. Every scream became a chorus line in a script of dominance. Children and elders alike were present. Memory was the point. The captives' suffering became a story the community told itself, proof that enemies could be broken and that order was secure. In ancient Rome, defeated enemies marched in triumphal parades before their deaths. Kings and generals paraded through the streets, sometimes forced to carry symbols of their lost power, their humiliation part of the celebration. At the end of the procession, execution might follow, often staged as part of gladiatorial spectacle. Death was never the end alone. It was the climax, the final act in a theater of conquest. The eerie truth is that communities didn't just kill to remove threats, they killed to create meaning. A ritual execution wasn't only about the victim, it was about everyone watching, everyone remembering. Death was turned outward, converted into a collective lesson that reinforced boundaries. This is us, that is them, and this is what happens when them loses. Theatrical killings also sanctified political order. A new ruler might execute captives to display his legitimacy, his ability to command violence with cosmic approval. Priests might oversee killings to stitch religion into politics, turning blood into proof of divine sanction. Every act was layered political authority, religious ritual, social intimidation, all performed on the body of the defeated. What makes this theater so chilling is its artistry. Death was choreographed, stylized, repeated like ritual drama. Victims were painted, bound, dressed, or posed. Sometimes they were forced to participate, reciting words, fighting hopeless battles, or enacting symbolic roles before being killed. It was not just execution, it was pageantry, and the stage was always the body of the enemy. But death didn't end with theater. Once the performance was over, the memory of the defeated was reworked too. Their identities could be erased, rewritten, or transformed into myth. The last step in turning enemies into property or offering was not physical at all, it was narrative. Once the body of the defeated had been worked, paraded, sacrificed, or staged, there remained the final layer of ownership, memory. Conquerors rarely left their enemies to vanish quietly. Instead, they rewrote them, recast them, folded them into stories where their only role was to confirm the victor's power. In Mesopotamian inscriptions, defeated kings are shown kneeling at the feet of the conqueror, their names recorded only to highlight humiliation. Egyptian reliefs depicted pharaohs smiting enemies who were reduced to identical figures, faceless crowds whose individuality evaporated into hieroglyphs. Even in death, the enemy's body was stripped of personhood. They became symbols, props, illustrations of the ruler's cosmic duty to uphold order. Among oral societies, the rewriting was just as sharp. Captured enemies might be spoken of not as individuals, but as lessons. Their names vanished, replaced by nicknames that reduced them to archetypes. The one who cried, the one who fell, the one who fell the gods. Memory didn't preserve them, it dissolved them. The enemy's afterlife was a cautionary tale, told by the fire to remind children what awaited outsiders. But memory could also elevate. Sometimes, defeated enemies became absorbed into the mythic past. In the Andes, sacrifices in the Copacoca rituals were remembered not as victims but as holy offerings, their lives recast as sacred gifts. Among the Iroquois, adopted captives who replaced the dead were rebranded entirely, their old identities erased, their new ones folded into kinship memory. To remember them as anything else would break the illusion. History itself was rewritten at the point of absorption. Erasure and elevation were two sides of the same coin. Both ensured that the defeated no longer belonged to themselves. Their stories were controlled, curated, retold, only in ways that reinforced the victor's worldview. A person became an allegory, a rival became an ancestor, an enemy became a ghost whose name could never be spoken except in the script chosen by the living. And this wasn't only symbolic. Graves could be defaced, names scratched out, monuments destroyed. To forget deliberately was another form of killing spiritual annihilation. The ancient Egyptians called it damnatio memoria, erasing names to deny souls entry into the afterlife. Across cultures, memory itself was property. To control it was to own not only the present body, but the eternal one. The irony is that this practice continues long after the ritual's end. Archaeologists unearth bones, scholars debate inscriptions, museums display skulls and mummies behind glass. The defeated enemy becomes an exhibit, their story once again repurposed for someone else's narrative, first owned by conquerors, now owned by history. Their value remains negotiable, sometimes sacred, sometimes grotesque, sometimes reduced to a curiosity for tourists who can't pronounce their names. And so the cycle closes. From kill to capture, labor to offering, humiliation to consumption, the defeated were never simply discarded. They were recycled into property, into ritual, into spectacle, into memory. Their lives and deaths were not just events but resources, wrung dry for every drop of utility. Even their stories were stolen, rewritten until nothing of them remained except the functions they served. The final transformation of the defeated enemy wasn't their death but their disappearance into someone else's meaning. A life once lived, now a line in someone else's myth. In many early societies, existence itself was framed as a kind of obligation. To be born was to owe, to the gods who supposedly breathed life into clay, to the ancestors who had suffered before you, to the community that kept you alive with food, shelter, and protection. A human life wasn't seen as freely owned, it was a loan, and loans demanded repayment. Slavery, in this light, wasn't just domination, it was debt service made flesh. Take Mesopotamia, where even the word for slave in cuneiform overlaps with servant and debtor. Families who couldn't repay loans handed over children to creditors, binding them into service, not as punishment, but as collateral. It was the same logic applied to fields and flocks. If you couldn't pay with grain or cattle, you paid with blood. The body itself was treated like a ledger, carrying the mark of debt, until someone balanced the account. This wasn't peculiar to Mesopotamia. In India, the Sanskrit term DDSA could mean both slave and devoted servant of the gods. The overlap was no accident. Work wasn't just economic, it was spiritual. The enslaved body became a living reminder that debts, whether to men, kings, or gods, had to be honored. Failure to serve wasn't disobedience alone. It was sacrilege, a disruption of cosmic order. The eerie elegance of this system lay in how natural it felt. Everyone owed something. Farmers owed tribute to lords. Lords owed sacrifices to gods. Families owed honor to ancestors. Debt ran downward and upward, like irrigation canals, binding society into a constant exchange. Slavery simply embodied that logic in its most extreme form. When obligations overflowed, they consumed a body. What's striking is how often this was explained, not in cruelty but in necessity. Ancient law codes, like Hammurabi's, regulated debt bondage with chilling precision, how long a debtor could be held, how their children might eventually be freed. It wasn't framed as injustice, but as management, as though humans were grain sacks on loan. The morality wasn't about freedom, it was about keeping the balance, and that balance wasn't only earthly. In West African traditions, captured enemies sometimes became perpetual offerings to ancestors. Their labor in households wasn't just exploitation, it was framed as repayment to the spirits who had allowed victory. To own a slave was to demonstrate you were settling debts with the invisible world, that you hadn't forgotten the obligations hanging over your lineage. In this way, ownership doubled as piety. Even the Mediterranean carried echoes of this logic. Romans spoke of the nexum, the bond that tied debtors to creditors, sometimes literally with ropes around the neck. The idea wasn't that a person ceased to exist when enslaved, it was that their existence had been mortgaged, their freedom temporarily repossessed like farmland left unpaid. Bodies became interest payments on obligations stretching beyond one lifetime. So slavery, in this framing, wasn't random brutality, was the visible symptom of a society where nothing was ever truly owned, only borrowed. Every loaf of bread, every favor, every act of protection implied a debt to be repaid. And when debts piled too high, someone's life was swallowed into servitude, not as an accident, but as the natural consequence of owing too much to too many. But debts weren't always financial. Sometimes, defeat itself created imbalance. When enemies fell in battle, their lives weren't discarded, they were transformed into living compensation for the blood spilled. War, like debt, demanded repayment, and the captives who survived were destined to become the currency. War was never just about territory or cattle. In many cultures, it was also about numbers, how many had been lost, and how many had to be repaid. Death left holes in a community, not only in the workforce but in the spiritual balance of the world. Captives filled those holes. They weren't merely spoils of war. They were accounting entries in a cosmic ledger, lives traded to balance out the lives taken. The Iroquois understood this with brutal clarity. Their so-called mourning wars weren't launched to wipe out neighbors, but to replace the dead. When warriors fell, raids were organized to capture outsiders who could be adopted into families. Sometimes the transition was merciful. The captive folded into kinship and treated as though they had always belonged. Other times it was crueler ritual tortures, ceremonial killings, or forced labor meant to match the suffering that death had inflicted. Either way, the captive's life was never their own. It was payment, extracted to heal wounds that weren't theirs to begin with. In West Africa, the logic ran parallel. After battles, captives were offered as living reparations to ancestors. Blood spilled demanded blood replaced, and enemies spared from immediate slaughter were bound into perpetual service. Their labor a standing offering to the spirits who had made victory possible. The enemy's survival wasn't kindness, it was tribute, transformed into ongoing repayment to the invisible. Mesoamerica sharpened this practice into ritual theater. Among the Aztecs, captives were essential to cosmic upkeep. They weren't killed in battle but taken alive so that their deaths could be staged later. Hearts cut out on temple steps to feed the sun. In this worldview, every fallen Aztec warrior created imbalance in the sacred order, and every captive sacrificed redressed it. War was a harvest, and the harvest was measured in living bodies destined to die. Even in the Mediterranean, echoes lingered. Ancient Greeks enslaved defeated enemies not only to work fields but to honor gods. Captives could be offered in temples, chained as visible proof that divine favor had tilted the scales of war. To enslave was to thank the gods, to balance the unseen account books of victory and loss. What emerges across these cultures is a strikingly consistent belief that death couldn't be left unaddressed. To lose members of a community without extracting compensation was dangerous, spiritually reckless. The imbalance might anger gods, unleash spirits, or leave ancestors restless. Captives were the substitute payment, their lives mortgaged to settle debts they had never incurred. And this wasn't hidden, it was public. Rituals of adoption, enslavement, or sacrifice were witnessed, retold, embedded into memory. The captive's fate became part of the community's healing, a visible demonstration that the balance had been restored. Their bodies were both punishment and medicine, instruments for soothing grief and repairing order. But not every imbalance came from war. Sometimes the debt was personal, born not of battles but of transgressions, crimes, dishonor, disruption of the social fabric. In those cases, slavery appeared not as spoils of conquest but as a sentence, a way of making wrongdoers repay the community. Here, bondage became less about conquest and more about cosmic redress. Not all slaves were captured in the chaos of war. Some were created quietly, through judgment. In many early societies, crime wasn't simply a matter of breaking laws, it was a matter of breaking balance. Theft, violence, adultery, insult to the gods each was seen as a tear in the fabric of order. And just as spilled blood demanded repayment on the battlefield, broken order demanded repayment in daily life. The solution was often enslavement, turning the wrongdoer into a living fine, their body pledged as restitution. In Mesopotamia, law codes like Hammurabi's spelled this out with unnerving neatness. If a man couldn't pay damages, he or his family could be handed over as slaves to the injured party. The act wasn't framed as cruelty. It was compensation, the offender's labor paying down the imbalance he'd created. One crime begot one debt, and the debt begot servitude. Justice was bookkeeping, and the body was the ledger. Ancient Israel's traditions echoed the same logic. In the Torah, theft could lead to debt slavery if restitution wasn't possible. The thief's freedom was collateral, his servitude the visible repayment of what could not otherwise be restored. Freedom wasn't inalienable, it was conditional, revoked when moral balance tipped too far. Across Africa, similar customs played out. Among the Yoruba, those who disrupted order through crime, misfortune, or even insolvency could fall into servitude, their labor not just a practical solution but a spiritual one. The offender's work was said to cleanse pollution, to draw out the imbalance they had caused. They weren't merely punished, they were used as vessels to carry away disorder, as if bondage itself were a ritual detergent. And here lies the eerie irony. Slavery as punishment was often presented as merciful. The alternative was death. To be enslaved was to be spared, though the life one kept was no longer one's own. This mercy was double. The condemned lived on, but only as tools, their labor a reminder to the community that cosmic balance had been restored at their expense. Even in Greece and Rome, this logic lingered. Criminals and debtors could be enslaved as a form of reparation, their servitude symbolizing the state's ability to reassert order. Their condition wasn't just social, it was moral. A wrong had been done, and the body of the wrongdoer became the repayment. The anthropological thread weaving through all these examples is a kind of moral accounting. Crime wasn't just between individuals, it was between humans and the universe itself. To sin, to steal, to disrupt was to create imbalance that radiated outward. That imbalance had to be neutralized, often by converting the offender into property. Enslavement wasn't punishment alone, it was cosmic redress, a ritualized way of saying, the debt has been repaid. But debts weren't always created by crime. Sometimes they arose from sheer misfortune, from bad harvests, failed business, or hunger. Families didn't need to steal to find themselves indebted, and when they couldn't pay, the same solution loomed: bodies offered in service. Here, slavery emerged not as punishment, but as collateral for survival. The cruel arithmetic of debt bondage. Slavery didn't always come from spears or crime. Sometimes it came from a bag of grain, a failed harvest, or the slow mathematics of poverty. Debt bondage was one of the most widespread pathways into servitude, and it carried the same spiritual logic. Debt wasn't just financial, it was moral, almost cosmic. To owe and not repay wasn't merely failure, it was imbalance, a dangerous fracture in the social fabric that had to be repaired with flesh. Mesopotamian records make this brutally clear. Clay tablets describe families pledging children as debt servants when loans went unpaid. The logic wasn't sentimental. If wealth had been borrowed, something had to be returned. If no cattle or crops remained, bodies became collateral. In Babylon, such service could legally last 3 years, after which debtors might be freed. But the market left was deeper. The idea that existence itself could be repossessed like farmland left fallow. In ancient India, the practice was equally entrenched. The DDSA system tied debtors to servitude, the very term overlapping with spiritual devotion. To serve a creditor wasn't just to settle accounts, it was to acknowledge one's place in a hierarchy that mirrored cosmic order. Debtors became slaves of debt, their bodies reminders that failure to repay disrupted more than economics. It disrupted Dharma itself. Rome, too, institutionalized debt slavery under Nexum. A debtor might be ceremonially bound, sometimes literally with a rope around the neck, to symbolize the creditor's claim. The debtor's body was a living contract, walking proof that obligations were sacred, and that failing to honor them reduced a person to property. Only later reforms loosened this bond, but the shadow of the practice lingered. And in Africa, debt bondage persisted in countless variations. A farmer who borrowed cattle or seed and failed to repay could see children pledged into another household, their service framed not as punishment, but as repayment to ancestors who had been dishonored by unpaid dues. Here, debt was pollution, and slavery was the cleansing act, labor scrubbing away imbalance. The irony of debt bondage is that it was often voluntary, or at least presented as such. Families chose which child to give, who could best bear the weight of service, who might survive and eventually return. In some cases, those bound into servitude were treated with relative leniency, seen as temporary assets rather than permanent property. But the underlying principle was unchanged. To owe was to risk your freedom. Even when redemption was possible, the stigma remained. A freed debtor was still a person who had been weighed and found lacking, someone whose body had been a stand-in for unpaid dues. Servitude left traces, scars on identity that couldn't easily be erased. Debt bondage also reveals something larger: the way ancient societies collapsed the boundary between economics and spirituality. Failing to repay wasn't just poor business, it was an offense against order, a fracture in the delicate balance linking gods, ancestors, and community. Slavery was the tool to repair it, to make visible again the truth that no debt could remain unsettled. But debts weren't only owed to creditors or gods. Families owed debts to their dead as well. When honor was lost, when ancestors demanded satisfaction, lives could be pledged to restore balance. In those cases, slavery was less about money and more about lineage, about paying what was owed to blood and memory. Debt wasn't only measured in cattle or grain. It extended backward, stretching into the domain of the dead. Ancestors, in many traditions, were creditors with long memories. To neglect them was to invite misfortune, drought, or illness. To honor them was to keep the balance of life and death intact. Slavery, in this framework, could be understood as repayment not to a creditor with clay tablets or contracts, but to the restless spirits of the lineage. In West Africa, this logic shaped how households absorbed captives. Enslaved people weren't simply workers. They were sometimes framed as permanent offerings to the ancestors. Their labor in the household, in the fields, or in ritual service was said to appease the dead, to ensure the lineage didn't fall into disfavor. The ancestors demanded continuity, and the defeated enemy became the currency by which it was purchased. A body kept in bondage was a debt paid forward to the invisible. Among the Ashanti, for instance, captives taken in war might be sacrificed at funerals of nobles, their deaths sealing the passage of the deceased into the ancestral world. But more often, they were retained, their daily work interpreted as an ongoing offering. They carried wood, tilled soil, and raised crops, not just for their masters but for the satisfaction of the ancestors whose eyes never closed. Their sweat was seen as incense for the dead. Even beyond Africa, the same thread appears. In ancient China, filial piety meant debts to ancestors were as binding as debts to the living. Failure to perform rituals, to maintain graves, to continue offerings, it all risked ancestral anger. Families impoverished by these obligations sometimes pledged members into servitude, their labor underwriting duties to the dead. Servitude became not just economic but ancestral, the living body substituted to keep the dead appeased. This blending of slavery and ancestor debt shows how fluid ownership could be. An enslaved person wasn't merely the property of a household. They were also tied to a lineage's reputation. Their obedience was proof that the family had not neglected its debts to the past. In this sense, the enslaved were positioned not just at the bottom of social hierarchy, but in a strange middle space between living kin and ancestral ghosts. And the irony, the captive could outlive their masters. Generations passed, and yet the obligation remained, binding their descendants into the same household, their servitude explained not by conquest alone but by lineage duty. The debt was hereditary, echoing the idea that obligations to ancestors never expired. If one family line had dishonored another, its repayment might stretch across lifetimes. But ancestors weren't the only spiritual forces demanding compensation. Gods too required offerings, and sometimes slavery itself became a living sacrifice, a way of keeping divinity satisfied without blood on the altar. In those cases, bondage wasn't final death but deferred sacrifice. The enslaved body transformed into a standing gift to the divine. In some societies, captives and slaves weren't killed outright in sacrifice. Instead, they were kept alive, their existence framed as a kind of offering stretched across years. They became living sacrifices, flesh and blood tributes, whose labor and presence were interpreted as devotion to the gods. Death was postponed, but the principle remained the same. The body no longer belonged to itself. It had been redirected into sacred service. Among the Aztecs, some captives were sacrificed immediately on temple steps, their blood spilling into the mouths of stone gods. But others were preserved, dedicated to temples where they carried out ritual duties, swept courtyards, prepared offerings, or tended fires. Their survival didn't mean reprieve, it meant their lives were now installments of worship. Every movement a form of repayment to the divine. The gods still owned them. The deadline had simply been extended. In West Africa, similar logics appeared. Slaves were sometimes bound to shrines, designated as temple servants, who lived not for themselves but for the deity. Their labor was seen as perpetual sacrifice, a way of sustaining gods without constant slaughter. To wake, to work, to breathe, it was all liturgy, a drawn-out sacrifice measured in years rather than moments. The Mediterranean held echoes of this as well. In Greece, sacred slaves hierodoloi were dedicated to temples, their service considered a living gift. They weren't killed, but their freedom was permanently surrendered to divine upkeep. At Delphi, for example, temple servants maintained the sanctuary, their labor itself a ritual, their lives pledged not to masters but to Apollo. The eerie thing about this system is its efficiency. Killing a captive in ritual created spectacle but ended utility. Keeping them alive preserved the offering while extracting labor. It was the religious equivalent of putting sacrifice on an installment plan. The gods were honored continuously, while the household or temple reaped ongoing benefit. The captive's body became a kind of spiritual savings account, paying interest through servitude. This arrangement blurred boundaries between ritual and daily life. Sweeping a temple courtyard became worship. Grinding grain for priests became liturgy. Planting crops became a prayer in motion. The enslaved body wasn't just property, it was a mobile altar, its toil transmuted into sacred currency. Yet this didn't mean death was off the table. Sometimes, when rituals demanded, these living sacrifices were eventually killed. Their long years of service had been preparation, fattening the symbolic calf before slaughter. Their final offering was staged as the climax of a life already surrendered. Death wasn't avoided, it was simply deferred, stretched out to extract every ounce of value before the gods collected in full. And here lies the unsettling continuity. Sacrifice deferred made bondage inseparable from ritual. The enslaved didn't just serve households or kings, they served gods, ancestors, and spirits, their lives explained as repayment in a cosmic economy that stretched far beyond them. They weren't only laborers, they were carriers of imbalance, vessels for pollution, substitutes for offerings, soaking up danger on behalf of the living. Which brings us to another thread, the belief that slaves absorbed misfortune itself. They weren't only offerings to gods, but also sponges for contamination, their bodies bearing the stains of bad luck, disease, or spiritual disorder that households needed cleansed. In many traditions, slavery wasn't just about labor or property, it was about cleansing. The enslaved were sometimes imagined as vessels into which pollution, misfortune, or disorder could be poured. Their presence, their toil, even their suffering became a kind of purification ritual for households and communities. In this sense, bondage wasn't framed only as punishment or repayment. It was spiritual sanitation. Among West African groups, there are records of captives being ritually marked to signify their role as bearers of pollution. They weren't merely outsiders. They were designated containers of dangerous forces. People whose bodies could absorb curses or carry away the imbalance left by conflict, famine, or illness. When something went wrong, bad harvest, a child's death, it could be pinned to the slave. Their marginality made them ideal scapegoats, permanent lightning rods for misfortune. Ancient Greece offers a similar thread. During crises, Athens practiced rituals involving pharmacore. Human scapegoats softened slaves, criminals, or social outcasts who were expelled, beaten, or even killed, to cleanse the city of plague or famine. These individuals weren't punished for what they'd done. They were sacrificed for what they represented. Contamination embodied. Their deaths or expulsions symbolically carried away the community's collective pollution. In India, notions of ritual purity, structured servitude, to certain groups relegated to bonded labor, were considered inherently impure. Their work handling waste, leather, or corpses, marked as spiritually polluting. Their bondage wasn't just social, it was framed as cosmological necessity. Someone had to carry the stain, and slavery provided bodies to absorb it. Even Rome carried echoes of this logic. During military defeats or natural disasters, rituals of human sacrifice, later symbolically replaced with effigies, were sometimes performed, often using prisoners of war or slaves. The idea was simple. Misfortune had to be transferred, balanced, cleansed, through the life of someone marked as expendable. The captive was less an individual than a sponge, soaking up the universe's disorder so the community could remain intact. This logic reveals an unsettling inversion. Bondage wasn't always explained as the degradation of the slave. Sometimes it was interpreted as the household's safeguard. To own a slave was to have someone else carry your bad luck, someone else to catch the blow when the gods or ancestors struck out. Their marginality was their value. Of course, this didn't make their lives safer. Being cast as a vessel of pollution meant they could be sacrificed, expelled, or killed at any sign of crisis. The very logic that gave them purpose also made them perpetually disposable. Their lives were insurance policies constantly at risk of being cashed in. The eerie continuity is how routine this became. Pollution, misfortune, imbalance, all of it was externalized into enslaved bodies, turning them into cosmic janitors. Their labor didn't just sustain households, materially it purified them spiritually, sweeping away contamination one exhausting task at a time. But enslavement wasn't only a matter of pollution. It was also formalized through sacred contracts, oaths, and rituals that bound the enslaved spiritually as well as physically. Servitude was not just an economic arrangement, it was a covenant, sealed with the weight of gods. Slavery in many traditions wasn't just a brute fact of power. It was wrapped in ritual language, sealed with oaths, and sanctioned by the sacred. The act of binding one person to another often carried the weight of a contract, not only between master and servant, but between humans and gods. Servitude became less about chains and more about vows solemn, declarations that turned domination into something cosmically legitimate. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets sometimes recorded these arrangements as sworn obligations, invoking deities as witnesses. To break such a bond wasn't merely a civil matter. It was sacrilege, inviting divine wrath. The enslaved person's obedience and the master's ownership were framed as parts of a larger covenant, monitored by unseen judges who could punish both parties if the terms were violated. In the Islamic world, too, slavery was bounded by sacred language. The Quran and later legal traditions emphasized that slaves were entrusted to masters under God's watchful eye. Manumission, freeing a slave, was considered a pious act, an atonement for sins, almost as though the slave's bondage was a divine trust temporarily loaned to the master. The entire relationship was cast less as raw power and more as stewardship, a spiritual contract where the owner answered as much to heaven as to law. Across West Africa, initiation oaths reinforced similar patterns. Enslaved people might be forced to swear loyalty in ritual ceremonies, binding them not just socially but spiritually. These oaths often invoked ancestors or deities, making rebellion or escape not just betrayal but sacrilege. By placing the contract under divine surveillance, societies ensured that servitude wasn't easily broken. To run away wasn't merely to defy a master, it was to offend the gods. Even Rome, pragmatic as ever, cloaked servitude in sacred language. Household slaves swore loyalty to their dominus, and temples sometimes housed records of contracts. To violate them was to invite both legal punishment and divine disfavor. Religion gave weight to law, and law gave permanence to subjugation. The eerie irony here is how thoroughly power was spiritualized. Chains were visible, yes, but the real binds were invisible, forged by oaths that stretched beyond the material. To be enslaved was to be locked into a sacred contract that declared your service a divine expectation. Your labor became obedience not just to a man or a household, but to the cosmic order itself. And this wasn't only about obedience. Sacred contracts also framed liberation. In many traditions, manumission was formalized with ritual, witnesses called, offerings made, vows spoken. Freedom wasn't just social release, it was spiritual redemption, as if the debt carried in bondage had finally been settled. The same oaths that bound a slave could later sanctify their release. But this framing of loyalty as covenant only deepened the sense that slavery was never merely economic. It was moral, ritual. To disobey was to violate a sacred promise. To serve was to fulfill it. And in this strange spiritual economy, even liberation was never absolute. Freedom had to be bought, prayed for, or granted as an act of redemption. Which leads naturally into another unsettling theme: how emancipation itself was framed not as release from bondage, but as the redemption of a soul, freedom understood as a form of ransom in the cosmic marketplace. If slavery was framed as a kind of debt, then freedom was imagined as its repayment or redemption, a release not just from work but from obligation itself. In many cultures, emancipation wasn't treated as a mere legal shift, it was a spiritual event, a balancing of cosmic books. To free a slave was to redeem a soul, and often the act was credited not to the slave but to the master. who gained merit by loosening the chains. In Mesopotamia, debt slaves were sometimes freed after a set number of years, their release marked by ritual proclamations. These weren't just practical resets for the economy, they were political and spiritual gestures. Rulers declared clean slates, amagi in Sumerian, literally return to mother, freeing debtors to restore harmony in society. Emancipation here was cosmic bookkeeping, a periodic wiping clean of imbalance so that order could continue. The Hebrew Bible echoes this with the Jubilee year. Every 50th year, slaves were to be freed, debts cancelled, and land returned. The logic wasn't economic efficiency alone, it was divine mandate. God himself was framed as the ultimate creditor, and the liberation of slaves was repayment to him, not kindness to them. Freedom became a ritual of obedience to heaven, a collective redemption staged on earth. In the Islamic tradition, manumission carried explicit spiritual weight. Freeing a slave was prescribed as an act of expiation, a way to atone for sins ranging from breaking oaths to failing in religious duties. A master who freed a slave didn't just release a person, he redeemed himself, buying back favor from God. The slave's bondage, in this worldview, was a test placed in the master's hands, and freedom was the master's chance to pay down his own spiritual debt. Rome, pragmatic yet ritualistic, also clothed manumission in ceremony. A slave could be freed before a magistrate or in a temple, the act sealed by symbolic gestures like the striking of a rod. Freedmen often took the family name of their former master, a reminder that redemption wasn't absolute, it carried the stamp of prior ownership. Even in freedom, the weight of debt lingered, reshaped into patronage, obligation, and loyalty. What links these examples is a shared belief. Freedom had to be earned, not simply by the slave, but by the master who granted it. Liberation was framed less as a right restored, and more as a transaction completed. It wasn't emancipation from debt, but the moment when the debt was finally acknowledged as paid by divine command, political decree, or ritual gesture. The unsettling irony is that freedom, too, was property. It could be bought, sold, granted, withheld, or used to polish reputations. A master's generosity was praised, the slave's gratitude expected. Redemption was never framed as balance between equals. It was always another form of hierarchy, with the master cast as savior and the slave as debtor. And yet, in many traditions, this release was also tied to death. Slaves buried with their masters, servants sacrificed at funerals, or freed for the afterlife, were reminders that emancipation didn't end with life, it extended into eternity. Which brings the final step in this long chain, how slavery itself reached beyond the grave, binding the living and the dead in a cycle of obligation that didn't stop at death's door. For many societies, slavery didn't end with death. The idea of servitude as debt stretched into the afterlife, as if even the grave couldn't clear the account. Masters expected loyalty from their servants beyond the limits of mortality, and enslaved people were often carried with them into tombs, sometimes alive, sometimes as offerings, sometimes symbolically carved into stone to serve forever. In ancient Egypt, tomb paintings show slaves preparing food, pouring wine, or herding cattle for their masters in the next world. These weren't casual decorations. They reflected a belief that social order extended seamlessly into eternity. Just as masters owned bodies in life, they expected service in death. The enslaved were inscribed into memory as eternal attendants, their labor fixed into the architecture of immortality. China carried a similar weight. During the Shang dynasty, slaves were buried alongside kings and nobles, sometimes killed to accompany them into the afterworld. Their deaths weren't considered tragic. They were interpreted as loyal service, continuing beyond death. In later periods, terracotta figurines replaced human victims, but the logic remained. Servants, real or symbolic, were still bound to masters in the afterlife, their debt never expiring. Among the Scythians, Herodotus describes royal burials where attendants, horses, and even wives were killed to follow the dead king. The act wasn't framed as cruelty, but as necessity. Royal authority demanded a retinue, even in death. Servitude here wasn't temporary, it was eternal, a cosmic obligation that outlasted breath. West Africa to recorded echoes of this practice. In Ashanti and Dahomey funerals, slaves were sometimes sacrificed at the burials of rulers, their deaths ensuring the king did not enter the world of spirits alone. They became both offerings and company, bound to serve not just for a lifetime, but for an afterlife. Their existence was collateral in a spiritual economy that demanded continuity even in death. And in Europe, though direct burial sacrifices waned, memory carried the same logic. Slaves were remembered in wills, freed for the sake of the soul of the master, their manumission, an act of redemption tied to salvation. Here, bondage itself became part of spiritual bookkeeping. Freedom at death was framed less as kindness to the slave and more as insurance for the master's afterlife. The eerie irony is how absolute the system was. Slavery wasn't only about ownership in life, it was about carrying debt across thresholds. The enslaved were not imagined as individuals who could vanish at death, but as permanent fixtures in a moral economy, present in tombs, rituals, and memory. Their lives, and often their deaths, were the interest payments, ensuring that masters could continue their claims beyond the grave. In this way, memory became another form of bondage. The stories of slaves were preserved, not as their own, but as footnotes to the lives of those who owned them. Their identities dissolved, redefined as eternal service. Even in legacy, their existence was recycled as spiritual property. So slavery, framed as spiritual debt, reveals its full reach here. A system that began with life as obligation, extended through war, crime, and poverty, and closed only at the edge of the afterlife, if it closed at all. In the cosmic accounting books of many cultures, freedom was never fully free. Debt clung like shadow, binding the living, the dead, and even memory itself.